Between 1776 and 1914, America transformed from 13 rebellious colonies clinging to the Atlantic coast into a continental empire spanning from ocean to ocean. This wasn't just political evolution, it was human transformation on an unprecedented scale. Over 138 years, the United States grew from 5 million people to over 100 million, expanded its territory by nearly 30%, fought a civil war that killed 600,000 Americans, absorbed waves of immigrants from every corner of the globe, and emerged as a world power capable of challenging the greatest empires of Europe. But these grand historical narratives often lose the human element to the individual stories of ordinary people caught up in extraordinary times. History books tell us about presidents and generals, about laws and treaties, about economic statistics and territorial acquisitions. They rarely capture what it felt like to be a government clerk, witnessing the signing of the Declaration of Independence, or a mill worker experiencing America's Industrial Revolution, or a formerly enslaved person fighting for the Union Army. This is the story of America told through the eyes of those who lived it. 8 individuals from different backgrounds, different regions, different social classes, each representing a crucial period in the nation's development. Their personal experiences reveal how the grand sweep of American history felt to ordinary people navigating love and loss, hope and disappointment, freedom and oppression in a rapidly changing world. From the smoky halls of Independence Hall to the blood-soaked fields of Gettysburg, from the bustling factories of industrial New England to the sprawling cattle ranches of Mexican California, these voices remind us that history isn't just what happened, it's what happened to real people with names, faces, families, and dreams. Let's start today's story. Find yourself somewhere comfortable, maybe that favourite chair by the window, or perhaps stretched out on your bed with the pillows just right. Close your eyes if it helps you listen. Tonight, we're travelling back through time to meet 8 Americans whose personal stories reveal the hidden human drama behind the history you learned in school. These aren't the famous names you know, no Washington or Lincoln here, but ordinary people who witnessed extraordinary times. The summer heat in Philadelphia feels like a living thing, pressing down on your shoulders as you sharpen your quill for the 100th time this week. You're Thomas Whitman, 32 years old, and your ink-stained fingers have recorded more history in the past month than most men see in a lifetime. The year is 1776, and, outside Independence Hall, the world is changing with every stroke of your pen. Your desk sits in the corner of the assembly room, close enough to hear every heated exchange, but far enough away that the delegates sometimes forget you're there. That's how you prefer it. Invisible, essential, documenting democracy as it stumbles toward birth. The leather-bound ledger before you contains the most dangerous words ever written on American soil, and your careful script has preserved them for posterity. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You remember writing those words as Thomas Jefferson dictated the final draft. Your hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what you were recording. These weren't just pretty phrases. They were revolutionary ideas that would either birth a new nation or get you all hanged as traitors. The debates rage for hours. Should the Declaration condemn slavery? Jefferson's original draft included a scathing denunciation of the slave trade, but you watch South Carolina's delegates threaten to walk out. Edward Rutledge pounds the table, his face red with indignation. You would destroy our entire economy for the sake of philosophical consistency, he shouts at John Adams. The northern delegates argue back, but you can see compromise forming in the weary slump of their shoulders. You dip your quill again and cross out Jefferson's anti-slavery passage. The words disappear under careful strokes of black ink, but their ghost remains on the page and in your memory. This new nation will be born with a contradiction at its heart, and you're the one recording its first broken promise. John Hancock approaches your desk as the delegates prepare for the final vote. He's a big man with an even bigger personality, and his merchant's practical sense has kept the Continental Congress funded when passion alone wasn't enough. "Make sure you spell my name clearly, Thomas," he jokes, looking over your shoulder at the signature page. "I want King George to be able to read it without his spectacles." The vote comes just after noon on the 4th of July. You record each delegation's decision. New Hampshire, aye. Massachusetts, aye. Rhode Island, aye. The southern colonies hesitate longer, but eventually they fall in line. Even New York, which has been abstaining for weeks, finally joins the unanimous declaration. As the last vote is recorded, you feel the room's atmosphere change. These men are no longer loyal British subjects debating policy. They are revolutionaries who have just committed treason against their king. Benjamin Franklin, ancient and wise, at 70, catches your eye as the delegates begin to disperse. "We must all hang together," he says quietly, "or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." You write down his words, understanding that you've just become part of the conspiracy. Your ledger isn't just government paperwork anymore. It's evidence that could get you executed. The war news that crosses your desk grows grimmer through the summer. Washington's army suffers defeat after defeat. The British land massive forces in New York, and rebel casualties mount with each dispatch. You file reports from Valley Forge that describe soldiers without shoes marching through snow, leaving bloody footprints behind them. Their letters home, which you sometimes copy for official records, speak of hunger, cold, and a cause that seems increasingly hopeless. But you also record the small victories that keep hope alive. When Abigail Adams writes to her husband about remembering the ladies in the new Code of Laws, you copy her letter with a slight smile. When word arrives that France might join the American cause, you feel the delegates' excitement as they debate alliance terms. When Washington crosses the Delaware and surprises the Hessians at Trenton, the celebration in Independence Hall lasts until dawn. By 1780, your role has evolved beyond simple record-keeping. You draft correspondence with foreign diplomats, copy intelligence reports from spies behind British lines, and maintain the financial records that show just how desperately broke the new nation really island. Continental currency has become nearly worthless. "Not worth a continental" is the phrase everyone uses, but you keep meticulous accounts anyway, knowing that someday, somehow, these debts will need to be honoured. Your wife Sarah understands the importance of your work, even when you can't tell her the details. She sees the worry lines around your eyes, knows that some of the documents you bring home are written in code, understands that your clerk work might get the whole family arrested if the British win. But she also sees your quiet pride when you describe the debates, the passion of men like Adams and Jefferson and Franklin as they try to create something new in human history. The personal cost of revolution becomes clear when your younger brother joins Washington's Continental Army and dies of typhus at Valley Forge. You file his death certificate with hundreds of others, your professional composure barely concealing personal grief. This war isn't just about abstract principles anymore. It's taking the people you love. The Atlantic wind cuts through your oilskin coat as you scan the horizon for British sails. You're Captain Jonathan Miller, master of the merchant vessel Liberty's Dream, and every voyage since 1803 has become a game of cat and mouse with the Royal Navy. Your ship carries American cotton bound for European markets, But King George's officers see you as fair game in their war against Napoleon. Your crew of 12 knows the risks. Just last month, HMS Leopard attacked the USS Chesapeake and impressed 4 American sailors, claiming they were British deserters. It doesn't matter that 3 of the 4 men were born in Massachusetts. The British consider anyone who speaks English to be their property. Your own boatswain, Patrick O'Brien, carries forged citizenship papers, terrified that his Irish accent will earn him a lifetime in the Royal Navy. The morning sun reveals 3 ships on the horizon, and your heart sinks as you recognise the distinctive lines of British frigates. Through your spyglass, you watch their signal flags snap in the breeze. They're ordering you to heave to for inspection. You could try to run, but Liberty's Dream is a merchant vessel built for cargo capacity, not speed. Lower the colours and prepare to be boarded, you order reluctantly. Your crew gathers on deck, trying to look casual while hiding their fear. Young Timothy Harris, barely 18, and on his first voyage, clutches his birth certificate with white knuckles. You've seen British impressment parties drag away men half his age. The British officer who boards your ship is polite but determined. Lieutenant Williams of HMS Intrepid examines your papers with professional courtesy, while his armed marines watch your crew. American merchants, he says conversationally, always seem to attract so many British deserters. Remarkable coincidence, wouldn't you say, Captain? You bite back your anger. My men are all American citizens, Lieutenant. Their papers are in order. But you know papers don't matter when British captains need sailors. Williams walks along your crew, studying faces, listening to accents, looking for any excuse to claim jurisdiction. He stops in front of Sean Macready, your best topman, whose Dublin accent is unmistakable despite 15 years in Boston. You there? When did you last serve in His Majesty's Navy? Macready's hands shake as he produces his naturalisation papers, but Williams barely glances at them. Forged documents, he declares. This man is clearly a British subject. You watch helplessly as Marines drag Macready toward their boat. He looks back at you with desperate eyes, and you know you'll never see him again. The British Navy has swallowed another good sailor, leaving his American wife and children to wonder what happened to their husband and father. This scene plays out across the Atlantic hundreds of times each year. By 1807, the Royal Navy has impressed over 6,000 American sailors, men torn from their ships, their families, their lives, forced to serve a king they've never sworn allegiance to. Your ship's logbook records the theft of 3 more crew members over the next 2 years, each one a personal tragedy multiplied across American maritime communities. The economic warfare hurts almost as much as the impressment. Napoleon's continental system forbids European trade with Britain, while British orders in council prohibit neutral trade with France. As an American captain, you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. Either choice risks, confiscation of your cargo, and imprisonment of your crew. In Boston taverns, you hear the anger building among your fellow mariners. We didn't win our independence just to be pushed around like colonial subjects, declares Captain Samuel Morris, whose ship was seized by the British off Lisbon. The war hawks in Congress echo these sentiments, calling for military action to defend American honor. President Jefferson tries economic coercion instead. The Embargo Act of 1807 prohibits all American foreign trade, attempting to force Britain and France to respect American neutrality by denying them American goods. For merchants like you, the embargo is devastating. Liberty's Dream sits idle in Boston Harbor for months, while your savings dwindle and your crew seeks other work. Jefferson's damned embargo has done more damage to American shipping than the British ever did, you complain to Sarah, your patient wife, who has endured years of your extended voyages. She nods sympathetically while mending your sea-stained shirts, but her eyes show relief that you're home safe, even if it's because of economic disaster rather than successful voyaging. The embargo fails spectacularly and is repealed just before Jefferson leaves office, but tensions continue rising. By 1812, even you, a peaceful merchant who prefers profit to politics to support war against Britain, the impressment of American sailors cannot be tolerated indefinitely, and the British seizure of American ships has become intolerable. When Congress declares war in June 1812, you volunteer your ship and services to the US Navy. Liberty's Dream becomes an auxiliary vessel carrying supplies to American forces around the Great Lakes. Your intimate knowledge of Atlantic shipping lanes proves valuable for planning naval operations, and your crew's experience with British tactics helps train younger sailors. The war brings mixed results. British forces burn Washington, D.C., humiliating the young republic. But American naval victories on the Great Lakes shift the strategic balance. You're present at the Battle of Lake Erie, when Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry defeats a British squadron, sending his famous message, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." After years of running from British ships, the satisfaction of victory feels almost overwhelming. Your most memorable wartime experience comes during the bombardment of Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor. From Liberty's Dreams deck, you watch British ships rain shells and rockets on the star-shaped fortress throughout the night of the 13th of September, 1814. The explosions light up the darkness like deadly fireworks, and you wonder if the fort can possibly survive such an assault. At dawn, through the smoke and haze, you see it. The American flag still flying over Fort McHenry. A young lawyer named Francis Scott Key, who spent the night aboard a nearby ship, scribbles verses about what he's witnessed. "Oh say, can you see, by the dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming?" You watch him write what will become America's national anthem, inspired by the same sight that brings tears to your weather-beaten eyes. The Treaty of Ghent ends the war in December 1814, though news doesn't reach America until February 1815, after Andrew Jackson's stunning victory at New Orleans. The peace treaty doesn't mention impressment or maritime rights, the issues that started the war, but something fundamental has changed. British captains no longer stop American ships with quite the same arrogance, and American sailors walk a little taller in foreign ports. You return to civilian merchant shipping in 1815, but the experience has changed you. America isn't just a collection of former colonies anymore. It's a nation that can defend its interests and its people. The young republic has proven it can fight the world's greatest naval power to a standstill. And that proof of strength will influence American foreign policy for the next century. The factory bell's harsh clang tears you from fitful sleep at 4:30 a.m., just as it has every morning for the past 3 years. You're Mary Catherine O'Brien, 19 years old, and your calloused hands have learned to tie broken threads and operate spinning machines faster than most girls learn to embroider. The year is 1832, and you're part of something entirely new in American history, a young woman earning her own wages in the industrial mills of Lowell, Massachusetts. Your narrow bed in the company boarding house is barely wide enough for one person, but you're grateful for it. Most of the other mill girls come from farms where they shared beds with 3 or 4 sisters. Here in Lowell, you have your own space, your own small trunk for your possessions, and most importantly, your own money at the end of each week. The walk to the factory takes 15 minutes through streets that didn't exist when you were born. Lowell is an entirely planned industrial city, built around the powerful waterfalls of the Merrimack River. The red brick mill buildings stretch along the riverbank, like monuments to progress, their windows glowing yellow in the pre-dawn darkness, as hundreds of young women report for another 14-hour shift. Inside the weaving room, the noise is deafening. Hundreds of power looms thunder in mechanical rhythm, creating a wall of sound that makes conversation impossible. You've learned to read lips and communicate through gestures, and the constant vibration has given you a permanent slight tremor in your left hand. The air is thick with cotton fibers that make you cough, and in summer the temperature rises above 90 degrees with no ventilation. Your job is to tend 6 power looms simultaneously, watching for broken threads, empty bobbins, and mechanical problems. When a thread breaks, you must quickly tie it together without stopping the machine. When a bobbin runs empty, you replace it in seconds to keep production flowing. The work requires intense concentration and quick reflexes. A moment's inattention can result in tangled threads that ruin hours of work. Despite the harsh conditions, you feel a pride in your work that surprises your farm-raised family. You're part of creating something, transforming raw cotton into finished cloth that will be sold across America and exported around the world. Your weekly wages of $2.50, after paying $1.25 for room and board, represent more money than you've ever controlled in your life. The boarding house where you live is supervised by a stern but fair widow named Mrs. Prudence Adams. She enforces a 10 p.m. curfew, mandatory church attendance on Sundays, and strict moral conduct. But she also encourages the girls to improve themselves through education. The company provides evening lectures and maintains a lending library, part of their effort to prove that industrial work need not degrade young women. In the evenings, after your shift ends at 7 p.m., you attend these educational programs with the other mill girls. Last week, you heard Ralph Waldo Emerson speak about self-reliance, his words stirring something deep in your soul about individual potential and moral independence. The week before, a travelling lecturer discussed the political upheavals in Europe, making you aware that the world extends far beyond your New Hampshire farm and Massachusetts mill town. You've joined with several other girls to publish a literary magazine called The Lowell Offering. Writing by candlelight in your small room, you craft poems and stories about mill life, challenging the assumption that factory workers are too ignorant or exhausted for intellectual pursuits. When your story about a mill girl who saves her wages to attend college is published, your mother sends a proud letter from the farm, amazed that her daughter has become a published author. The political transformation happening around you is as dramatic as the Industrial Revolution. Andrew Jackson's presidency has democratized American politics in ways that would have shocked the Founding Fathers. You watch working men, your father among them, vote for the first time as property requirements disappear across the country. Jackson's opposition to the National Bank resonates with ordinary people who see Eastern financial elites as enemies of common folk. But this democratic revolution has disturbing limitations that trouble your increasingly educated conscience. The mill girls discuss politics during their brief dinner break, and Sarah Mitchell from Vermont raises uncomfortable questions. Why should my father have the vote just for being born male, while I must remain silent despite earning my own living and reading more books than he has? The question hangs in the air because none of you have a good answer. The contradictions of American democracy become even more apparent when you learn about your mill's raw materials. The cotton that feeds Lowell's machines comes from southern plantations worked by enslaved people. Your wages, your precious independence, depend on a system of forced labor that denies basic human rights to hundreds of thousands of Americans. The irony is not lost on you. Your freedom is built on others' bondage. A visiting lecturer from the American Anti-Slavery Society makes this connection explicit during an evening program in 1834. William Lloyd Garrison, publisher of The Liberator, describes the conditions on southern cotton plantations with brutal honesty. "Every yard of cloth produced in these mills," he declares, pointing toward your workplace, represents the unpaid labor of enslaved human beings. You cannot separate northern prosperity from southern slavery. His words spark heated debates in the boarding house. Some girls argue that they shouldn't be blamed for southern slavery, while others contend that benefiting from the system makes them complicit. Margaret Kelly from Ireland points out that her family fled poverty and oppression, and she can't worry about distant slaves when her own survival is at stake. But Susan Wright from Massachusetts insists that moral principles matter more than economic convenience. The debate becomes personal when Lucy Larkham, one of your closest friends among the mill girls, announces she's leaving Lowell to become a teacher. "I cannot continue earning wages from slave-produced cotton," she explains as you help her pack her few belongings. If education and moral principle mean anything, they must guide our choices, even when those choices cost us materially. Her departure forces you to examine your own conscience. The work at Lowell has given you independence, education, and a voice through your writing. But it has also made you part of an economic system that depends on human bondage. The mill owners speak eloquently about progress and prosperity, but they don't mention that their profits flow from plantations where people are bought and sold like livestock. The Cherokee removal crisis of 1835 adds another layer to your moral unease. As President Jackson implements his Indian Removal Act, Cherokee families pass through Lowell on their forced march westward. You watch from the mill windows as men, women, and children trudge past, carrying their possessions in bundles, their faces marked by exhaustion and despair. That evening, you write in your journal, "We speak much of American democracy and progress. But what democracy forces families from their ancestral homes? What progress builds prosperity on slave labor while claiming moral superiority? Perhaps the greatest education I've received in Lowell is learning to see the contradictions in our national character." By 1835, your perspective on America has grown complex and nuanced. The country is undoubtedly changing in remarkable ways. Women can earn independent livings, working men can vote, cities are rising from wilderness, and machines are transforming human labor. But these changes come with moral costs that your generation will have to address. The questions raised by your experience in Lowell about labor, about women's rights, about slavery, about democracy, will define American politics for the next 30 years. The morning mist clings to the valley floor as you ride among your cattle, counting heads before the vaqueros drive them to the upper pastures. You're Samuel Rodriguez, 34 years old, and your family has owned this land since your great-grandfather received the original Spanish grant in 1798. The year is 1846, and everything you've known is about to change with the approach of war between Mexico and the United States. Your rancho stretches across 15,000 acres of prime California grassland, supporting 3,000 head of cattle and 200 horses. The adobe house your grandfather built sits on a hill overlooking the valley, its thick walls keeping the interior cool even during the hottest summer days. From your front porch, you can see the Pacific Ocean glimmering on the western horizon, and on clear days, the snow-capped mountains to the east. Life has followed the same rhythms for generations. Spring brings the cattle roundup, when your vaqueros, the finest horsemen in the world, gather the herds for branding. Summer means the matanza, the great slaughter that provides tallow and hides for trade with Boston merchants who anchor their ships in Monterey Bay. Fall is for breaking wild horses and preparing for winter rains. It's a pastoral existence, connected to the land and seasons in ways that city dwellers can't understand. But war clouds have been gathering since American settlers began flooding into California. These newcomers don't understand Mexican land laws or respect traditional boundaries. They squat on your outer pastures, claim they're improving unused land, and demand American laws to protect their illegal settlements. Your complaints to Mexican authorities go nowhere. Mexico City is too far away and too weak to protect its California citizens. When war officially begins in May 1846, you try to remain neutral, but neutrality proves impossible when armies march across your land. American forces under Colonel John C. Fremont camp in your lower fields, their horses trampling wheat that was meant to feed your cattle through the winter. The soldiers are polite enough, but they requisition beef without payment and eye your wife Maria with uncomfortable familiarity. The war ends quickly with American victory, but the real challenges begin with peace. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 promises that Mexican citizens can become American citizens with full rights, including protection of property ownership. You choose American citizenship, hoping it will secure your family's future. But the reality proves more complicated than the treaty's promises. Gold changes everything. When James Marshall discovers gold at Sutter's Mill in January 1848, California transforms overnight from a sleepy pastoral society into a frenzied boomtown economy. Thousands of gold seekers pour across your land, following rumors of easy riches in the Sierra Nevada mountains. They don't ask permission to cross your property. They simply assume that empty land belongs to whoever wants to use it. The gold rush brings chaos to your ordered world. Miners camp on your best pastures, killing cattle for food without compensation. They pollute streams with their hydraulic mining operations, making the water unfit for livestock. They cut your oak trees for fuel and building materials, destroying forest cover that took centuries to grow. When you protest, they laugh at your Mexican claims and suggest you take your complaints to American courts. The legal system becomes your nightmare. American judges don't speak Spanish and seem skeptical of Mexican land grants, despite the treaty's guarantees. Lawyers charge enormous fees to translate your documents and navigate American property law, but their success is limited. Courts demand surveys that cost thousands of dollars, and even when surveys prove your ownership, squatters continue occupying your land while appeals drag on for years. Your neighbor, Don Carlos Vega, loses half his ranch to American squatters who claim adverse possession. They steal our land with their laws, he tells you bitterly, as you survey his former property from horseback. First, they ignore our ownership. Then they use their courts to make theft legal. His words prove prophetic, as similar cases multiply across California. The cultural changes are as painful as the legal ones. Your children attend the new American school, where they learn English and American history while their Spanish language and Mexican heritage are dismissed as backward remnants of a primitive past. Your daughter Elena comes home asking why California belonged to Mexico, if Americans are clearly more advanced and industrious. How do you explain that progress and justice aren't the same thing? The social hierarchy that defined your world collapses as American racial attitudes replace Mexican class distinctions. Under Mexican law, you were a respectable landowner, a man of property and influence in your community. Under American racial categories, you're just another greaser, lumped together with peon laborers and treated as racially inferior to any white American, regardless of education, wealth, or social standing. This racial prejudice has practical consequences when you try to defend your property rights. American juries rarely believe Mexican testimony against white squatters, no matter how clear the evidence. When you catch rustlers stealing your cattle, The local sheriff suggests that Mexican property owners should be grateful for American protection rather than complaining about minor thefts. Your wife, Maria, suffers particularly from the social changes. She spoke French and English fluently and corresponded with educated women in Mexico City and Europe, but American women treat her as an exotic curiosity or ignore her entirely. The elaborate social life that centered around the great ranchos, the hospitality, the dancing, the celebration of feast days, withers as Mexican families lose their land and influence. By 1855, you've lost nearly half your ranch to legal fees, fraudulent surveys, and outright theft. The cattle business that supported your family for 3 generations is no longer profitable as American agriculture and mining reshape California's economy. Your sons speak more English than Spanish and dream of becoming American businessmen rather than carrying on ranching traditions. Yet adaptation proves possible, if painful. You learn American business methods, invest in San Francisco real estate, and send your children to American schools while maintaining their Mexican heritage at home. The pastoral California of your youth is gone forever, but perhaps your family can find a place in this new American California. The great tragedy is the loss of a way of life that had achieved a remarkable balance between human society and natural environment. The rancho system, for all its flaws, had created a sustainable relationship with California's landscape. The gold rush and American settlement brought material progress, but destroyed that ecological harmony, perhaps permanently. As you watch the last great roundup on what remains of your land, you think about the price of progress. California is undoubtedly more prosperous under American rule, but prosperity has come at the cost of cultural diversity, environmental sustainability, and social justice. The state that emerges from the gold rush bears little resemblance to the pastoral paradise your great-grandfather knew, and you're not certain the trade was worth making. The morning fog off Boston Harbor carries the smell of salt and coal smoke as you march with the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment toward the transport ships. You're Sergeant William Freeman, 28 years old, and until 3 years ago, you were the property of a South Carolina planter. Now you wear the blue uniform of the United States Army, carrying a rifle in defense of the Union that finally acknowledges your humanity. Your path to this moment began in 1858 when you escaped from the Beauregard plantation outside Charleston. The Underground Railroad guided you through swamps and safe houses until you reached Massachusetts, where abolitionists helped you find work on the Boston docks. You taught yourself to read by studying discarded newspapers, sounding out words by candlelight in your rented room above Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. When President Lincoln first called for volunteers in 1861, black men were turned away from recruiting stations. This is a white man's war, officers explained, as if the slavery that had defined your entire life had nothing to do with the rebellion tearing the country apart. You waited impatiently as the war dragged on, knowing that black soldiers could help end the conflict that was really about black freedom. Everything changed with the Emancipation Proclamation and the authorization of black regiments. You were among the first to volunteer for the 54th Massachusetts, commanded by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, a young white officer from a prominent abolitionist family. The irony wasn't lost on you, a former slave taking orders from the son of wealthy reformers. But Shaw proved himself worthy of command through his genuine respect for his men's abilities and dignity. Training camp revealed the complexity of your situation. Many white officers arrived, expecting to command a regiment of ignorant former field hands, only to discover men like you who could read, write, and think tactically about military problems. Some adjusted their assumptions. Others never got past their racial prejudices. You learned to navigate these attitudes while focusing on the larger mission. Your fellow soldiers came from across the North's free black communities. Frederick Johnson had been born free in Philadelphia and worked as a carpenter before enlisting. Thomas Williams escaped from Virginia 3 years earlier and still carried scars from his master's whip. Samuel Green was the son of a famous minister and spoke 3 languages fluently. Despite your different backgrounds, you shared the knowledge that this war would determine whether America would finally live up to its founding ideals. The regiment's first major engagement came at Fort Wagner, South Carolina, in July 1863. Attacking a heavily fortified Confederate position, you advanced across open ground under murderous fire from artillery and rifle. Colonel Shaw fell just steps from the enemy parapet, and over half your regiment became casualties, but you proved that black soldiers would fight and die for freedom with courage equal to any white regiment. The aftermath of Fort Wagner brought mixed results. Northern newspapers celebrated your regiment's heroism, slowly changing public opinion about black military service. But Confederate forces buried Shaw in a mass grave, with his black soldiers intending to dishonor him. Instead, his family declared there was no greater honor than being buried with the men he had led into battle. Between engagements, you encountered the human reality of emancipation as enslaved people fled to Union lines. Their joy was heartbreaking and inspiring. Trimleys reunited after decades of separation, children learning their first letters, old men weeping as they held freedom papers. You helped a woman named Sarah find her son, sold away 15 years earlier, and witnessed their reunion with emotions you couldn't put into words. But emancipation also revealed the complexity of freedom. These newly liberated people had no money, no land, no education, and often no place to go. They looked to Union soldiers like you for guidance you weren't qualified to give. How do you explain labor contracts to people who have never been paid wages? How do you teach reading to adults who were forbidden education? How do you prepare people for citizenship who have never been allowed basic human rights? Your own education continued through military service. You learned military engineering from a German immigrant sergeant, studied mathematics with a former teacher from Ohio, and read every book you could find in abandoned Confederate houses. Knowledge felt like armor against those who would deny your humanity. Every fact learned, every skill mastered, was proof of intellectual equality. The war's racial dynamics grew more complex as it continued. Some white Union soldiers accepted black troops as equals, but others resented fighting alongside men they considered inferior. Confederate soldiers often murdered black prisoners rather than treating them as legitimate combatants, adding extra danger to your service. The Lincoln administration struggled to balance military necessity with political reality in a country where racism ran deep even among those opposed to slavery. Your regiment participated in the siege of Charleston, and walking through the city where you had been enslaved felt surreal. The elegant mansions where you had served as a house servant stood empty or damaged by Union artillery. The slave market, where you had watched families torn apart, was silent and abandoned. The revolution you had dreamed of during years of bondage was actually happening. Personal encounters with former masters revealed the psychological complexity of emancipation. When you met your former owner, Colonel James Beauregard, now a Confederate prisoner, he looked at your sergeant's stripes with confused bewilderment. "Billy," he said, using the name he had given you, "surely you don't believe you're the equal of white men?" Your answer, "I believe any man who would own another human being has proven his moral inferiority," left him speechless. The war's end in April 1865 brought celebration but also uncertainty. What would freedom mean in practice? Would the promises of equality be kept? Or would new forms of oppression replace slavery? As you marched through Richmond, the former Confederate capital, you saw both the potential for justice and the persistence of racial hatred that would make that justice difficult to achieve. Lincoln's assassination, just days after Lee's surrender, cast a shadow over victory. The president who had grown from viewing emancipation as military necessity to seeing it as moral imperative was gone, replaced by Andrew Johnson, whose commitment to racial equality seemed questionable. You wondered whether the man who had finally acknowledged your citizenship would be the last president to do so. Your final entry in the diary you kept throughout the war reflected on the transformation you had experienced. 4 years ago, I was property, forbidden to read or write, denied even the acknowledgement of my humanity. Today, I am Sergeant William Freeman, United States Army, a citizen of the American Republic. Whether that citizenship will be honored or betrayed remains to be seen, but no one can take away what we have proven on the battlefields of this war. The morning sun streams through the broken windows of what used to be Mount Olive Baptist Church as you arrange wooden crates to serve as desks for your students. You're Sarah Johnson, 25 years old, and every day you walk 3 miles from your cabin to teach reading and writing to the children of former slaves. The year is 1867, and you're part of something revolutionary and Black Americans, taking control of their own education in the heart of Georgia. Your path to this classroom began in slavery on the Whitmore plantation, where you were taught to read by Miss Margaret, the master's daughter who secretly defied her father's orders. Those stolen lessons, conducted in the attic while the family slept, gave you a gift that no master could take away, the ability to unlock knowledge from printed words. Freedom came with General Sherman's army in December 1864, but it brought confusion alongside liberation. You remember standing in the plantation yard with 93 other newly freed people, listening to a Union officer read the Emancipation Proclamation. The words were beautiful, forever free, but what did freedom actually mean? Where would you live? How would you eat? Who would protect you from angry whites who blamed you for their defeat? The Freedmen's Bureau helped establish your school in partnership with Northern Missionary Societies. Miss Amanda Collins, a stern but kind teacher from Massachusetts, arrived with boxes of books, slates and pencils, materials you had never imagined owning. She trained you and 3 other literate former slaves to become teachers, recognizing that Black students learned better from instructors who understood their experiences. Your students range in age from 5 to 50. Little Moses, barely old enough to hold a pencil, sits beside his grandfather Samuel, whose weathered hands shake as he traces letters on his slate. "Never thought I'd live to see my grandson learn to read," Samuel whispers, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Master always said we was too stupid for book learning." The hunger for education among former slaves amazes even sympathetic white observers. Your classroom, designed for 30 students, regularly holds 60. Parents work all day in the fields, then walk miles to attend evening classes. They save precious pennies to buy their children books, sacrificing food and clothing to pay for education. "Learning is our freedom," explains Martha Williams, whose son David dreams of becoming a doctor. But education brings danger along with opportunity. The Ku Klux Klan targets schools as symbols of Black advancement, burning buildings and threatening teachers. You've received anonymous notes warning you to stop uppity teaching, and riders in white hoods have been seen near your cabin. The fear is constant, but you continue because you know education is the key to meaningful freedom. Your brother Thomas exemplifies the political possibilities of Reconstruction. Elected to the Georgia legislature in 1868, he joins 60 other black representatives working to rebuild the South on principles of racial equality. Their legislative achievements are remarkable. Public schools for all children, infrastructure improvements, civil rights protections, and efforts to help former slaves acquire land. Yet the backlash against black political participation grows increasingly violent. The Klan murders 3 black legislators in nearby counties, and white supremacist newspapers call for the restoration of white rule. Thomas carries a pistol everywhere, and rarely travels alone after dark. They can kill us, he says grimly, but they cannot kill the idea that we have the right to participate in democracy. The violence reaches your community in September 1871. Night riders burn the schoolhouse while families sleep, reducing your classroom to ashes and charred timbers. The next morning, you stand in the ruins with your students, many of whom are crying. They can burn our building, you tell them, your voice steady despite your own tears, but they cannot burn what we've learned. We'll find another place to continue. You do find another place, an abandoned barn that the community repairs with donated labour and materials. Within a month, classes resume, but the message is clear. White supremacists will not tolerate black advancement. Every day of education is an act of defiance. Every student who learns to read is a victory against oppression. The federal government's protection proves inconsistent and temporary. President Grant sends troops to suppress the Klan, and for brief periods you feel genuinely safe. But political pressure mounts to reconcile with the South, and military protection gradually diminishes. By 1874, federal soldiers are rarely seen in your county, leaving black citizens vulnerable to intimidation and violence. Personal relationships across racial lines become increasingly strained. Miss Collins, your northern mentor, faces social ostracism from white Southerners who view her as a dangerous radical. She can't shop in town without enduring hostile stares and muttered threats. Her letters home describe the isolation and stress of working in a community where her very presence is seen as an assault on traditional racial hierarchy. The economic dimensions of freedom prove as challenging as the political ones. Most former slaves lack land, tools, or capital to become independent farmers. Sharecropping emerges as a compromise that often becomes another form of bondage. Your neighbour Jacob signs a contract that seems fair, but by harvest time he owes the landowner more than his share of the crop is worth, trapping him in perpetual debt. You supplement your teaching income by working as a seamstress, but even this modest economic independence threatens some whites. Nigger women getting too big for their britches, you overhear at the general store. Teaching school, earning money, thinking they're as good as white ladies. The hostility reminds you that freedom means more than legal status. In quote, it requires social acceptance that many whites refuse to grant. The presidential election of 1876 marks the beginning of the end for Reconstruction. Samuel Tilden, the Democratic candidate, promises to remove federal troops from the South and restore Home Rule, code words for white supremacist control. Rutherford Hayes, the Republican, wins through a corrupt bargain that trades electoral votes for the end of federal protection for black citizens. The Compromise of 1877 abandons Southern black Americans to the mercy of their former masters. Federal troops withdraw, and immediately the gains of Reconstruction begin disappearing. Black legislators are expelled from office, voting rights are restricted through poll taxes and literacy tests, and segregation laws proliferate across the South. Your school faces new threats as white supremacists regain political control. The state legislature cuts funding for black education, making it impossible to pay teachers or maintain buildings. Local officials harass you with arbitrary regulations and threats of closure. By 1878, your enrollment has dropped from 60 students to 20 as parents fear for their children's safety. The transformation from hope to despair happens remarkably quickly. The Constitution's 14th and 15th Amendments promise equality and voting rights, but words on paper cannot overcome determined resistance from those who refuse to accept black citizenship. The democracy that briefly flourished during Reconstruction gives way to a racial caste system that will persist for nearly a century. Your final diary entry from this period captures the tragedy. We tasted freedom and found it sweet, but America was not ready to let us swallow it. Our children learned to read and write. Our men voted and held office. Our women earned wages and owned property. For 12 years, we were citizens in fact as well as law. Now that citizenship is being stripped away, and we must prepare for a long struggle to reclaim what we briefly possessed. The ship's horn echoes across New York Harbor as you clutch your cloth bundle and peer through the crowd toward Castle Garden Immigration Station. You're Katerina Novak, 26 years old, and everything you own fits in 2 bundles tied with rope. The year is 1885, and you're part of the greatest migration in human history. Millions of Europeans seeking opportunity in America while fleeing poverty, oppression, and limited futures in their homelands. The Atlantic crossing in steerage was 3 weeks of hell. Packed into the ship's lowest decks with 200 other immigrants, you endured seasickness, spoiled food, and the constant fear that your youngest son might die from the fever that swept through the passengers. Your husband Pavel held you both together with quiet determination and the few English phrases he learned from a German passenger who had made this journey before. Castle Garden overwhelms your senses. A babble of languages as immigration officials process thousands of arrivals each day. Italian families argue with Irish dock workers, while German voices mix with Polish complaints and Jewish prayers. An immigration inspector examines your health certificate and asks questions in broken German, the closest he can come to your Czech language. America, he says, pointing toward the city beyond the immigration station. You America now. The train ride to Chicago takes 2 days through countryside, unlike anything you've ever seen. The forests of Pennsylvania give way to endless farmland in Ohio and Indiana, all of it flat and prosperous looking compared to the rocky hills of Bohemia. Other passengers point out landmarks and share advice in a mixture of languages, creating a community of strangers united by hope and uncertainty. Chicago assaults your senses with its size, noise, and energy. The city has rebuilt itself after the Great Fire of 1871, creating a landscape of brick buildings, smoking factories, and construction sites where new skyscrapers reach toward the sky. The smell of slaughterhouses mixes with coal smoke, and the indefinable odour of a city growing faster than its infrastructure can accommodate. Your first home is a single room in a tenement building shared with another Czech family. The Svobodas have been in America for 3 years and serve as your guides to this new world. Work hard, save money, learn English, advises Jan Svoboda, who found work in the stockyards. America gives you chance, but you must take it yourself. Pavel finds work at the Swift & Company meatpacking plant, joining thousands of men who process cattle and hogs from across the Midwest. He comes home exhausted, his clothes stained with blood and grease, but carrying wages that represent more money than your family ever possessed in the old country. The work is dangerous. Men lose fingers to machinery and slip on blood-slick floors, but it's steady employment in a growing industry. Your own work begins in a garment factory, operating a sewing machine for 12 hours a day in a crowded, poorly ventilated room. The Jewish foreman speaks broken English, but understands the universal language of piecework. 2. You're paid by the number of garments completed, creating constant pressure to work faster. Your fingers grow nimble on the machine, and gradually you earn enough to help supplement Pavel's wages. The ethnic neighborhoods of Chicago become your world within America. The Czech community centers around Street Wenceslaus Church, where services are conducted in your native language and familiar foods are served at church socials. Your children attend the parish school, learning English while maintaining their Czech heritage. The priest, Father Havel, helps families navigate American bureaucracy while preserving old country traditions. But America demands adaptation in ways both exciting and frightening. Your eldest daughter, Marie, learns English faster than you can keep up, coming home with stories of American history and ideas that challenge traditional authority. When she asks why women can't vote or attend university, you struggle to answer because America has made these questions seem reasonable in ways they never did in Bohemia. The contrast between American promises and immigrant realities becomes clear through daily experience. The Statue of Liberty speaks of welcoming huddled masses, but American workers often see immigrants as threats to their wages and job security. "Damn bohunks taking our jobs," you hear at the market, the slur making clear that your nationality is viewed as an insult. Economic cycles affect immigrant families with particular severity. The Depression of 1884 to 1885 closes factories and reduces wages, forcing your family to survive on bread and potatoes for months. Pavel's work at the packing house becomes sporadic, and you take in laundry to earn extra pennies. The American dream proves fragile when economic downturns reveal how quickly prosperity can disappear. The Haymarket affair of 1,886 erupts just blocks from your neighborhood, and you witness firsthand how quickly American opportunity can turn into American violence. When police charge striking workers demanding an 8-hour workday, the bomb explosion that kills 7 officers creates a hysteria that targets all foreign-born workers. Anarchist foreigners, the newspapers declare, making no distinction between peaceful immigrants and radical activists. The aftermath of Haymarket brings increased suspicion toward immigrant communities. Police raid Czech social halls looking for anarchist literature, and employers become reluctant to hire foreign-born workers. Your family keeps a low profile, avoiding political discussions and focusing on the gradual accumulation of savings that might someday buy a house or small business. Yet, adaptation continues despite setbacks. Your children become truly American, speaking English without accents and understanding cultural references that mystify you. They attend public school, participate in American holidays, and dream of futures that would have been impossible in Europe. Marie talks about becoming a teacher, while your son Joseph wants to study engineering gear, ambitions that American public education makes theoretically possible. The Hull House settlement, founded by Jane Addams, provides services that help immigrant families navigate American society. English classes, job training programs, and childcare allow women like you to improve your circumstances while maintaining family responsibilities. Miss Addams treats immigrant women with a respect rarely shown by native-born Americans, recognizing the strength required to build new lives in a foreign country. Your neighborhood gradually improves as families save money and invest in property. The Svobodas buy a small house with a garden where they grow familiar vegetables from the old country. Other families start small businesses, bakeries, tailor shops, saloons that serve familiar foods and provide spaces where Czech is the primary language. The community creates its own version of America, blending old and new worlds. By 1890, your family has achieved modest success by immigrant standards. Pavel has been promoted to foreman at the packing house. You've learned enough English to work as a translator for newer arrivals, and your children are excelling in American schools. The single room in the tenement has been replaced by a small apartment with a window that faces east, toward the old country you left but haven't forgotten. The transformation hasn't been easy, and it's far from complete. You still struggle with English, still feel like an outsider in many American social situations, still wonder whether your grandchildren will remember their Czech heritage. But you've given your family opportunities that wouldn't have existed in Europe, and that achievement justifies the sacrifices required to build a new life in America. Your diary entry from Christmas 1890 reflects on the immigrant experience. America is not the golden land we imagined, but it is a land where hard work can improve your circumstances and your children can dream of better futures. We came as foreigners and remain foreigners in many ways, but our children are Americans in ways we can never be. Perhaps that is enough. The December wind cuts across the South Dakota plains like a blade, carrying snow that stings your face as you ride toward the Pine Ridge Reservation. You're Lieutenant James Murphy, known as Hawk to your men for your sharp eyes and hunting skills, and you've spent 8 years in the U.S. cavalry fighting Indians across the western frontier. The year is 1890, and you're approaching what will be the last major confrontation between the U.S. military and Native American tribes. Your military career began in 1882, fresh out of West Point with romantic notions about frontier heroism and civilizing missions. The reality of Indian warfare proved far more complex and morally ambiguous than your academy textbooks suggested. You've chased Apache raiders through Arizona deserts, protected railroad crews from Lakota war parties, and enforced government policies that moved entire tribes from ancestral lands to barren reservations. The ghost dance movement that brought you to Pine Ridge represents something new in your experience with Indian resistance. Rather than armed rebellion, this is a religious revival that promises the resurrection of dead warriors and the disappearance of white settlers through spiritual power rather than military force. The dancers believe that their sacred shirts will protect them from bullets, and their passionate ceremonies have terrified white settlers and reservation agents. Your commanding officer, Colonel James Forsyth, views the ghost dance as dangerous sedition that must be suppressed before it spreads to other tribes. Religious fanaticism, he calls it, ordering increased patrols and restrictions on reservation movement. But you've watched the dancers and seen desperation more than defiance, a people grasping for spiritual hope when political and military resistance has proven futile. The arrest of Sitting Bull on the 15th of December escalates tensions dramatically. The great Lakota leader who defeated Custer at Little Bighorn 14 years earlier is killed during a confused confrontation with Indian police sent to bring him in. His death eliminates a symbol of resistance, but also martyrs him in the eyes of his followers, making peaceful resolution more difficult. Chief Bigfoot's band becomes your primary concern as they flee the Cheyenne River Reservation, apparently heading toward Pine Ridge to join other ghost dance adherents. Your troop pursues them across the frozen landscape, following tracks through snow and camping in temperatures that freeze your breath. The Indians you're chasing include many women, children, and elderly people, refugees, more than warriors, but orders are to intercept and disarm them. The confrontation occurs at Wounded Knee Creek on the 29th of December. Bigfoot, sick with pneumonia, agrees to surrender peacefully and leads his band of 350 people to the cavalry's designated camping spot. Your regiment surrounds the Indian camp with over 500 soldiers and 4 Hotchkiss guns. rapid-fire artillery pieces that can devastate infantry formations. The morning disarmament proceeds tensely but peacefully until a deaf warrior named Black Coyote refuses to surrender his rifle, apparently not understanding the officer's commands. In the struggle that follows, the weapon discharges accidentally, triggering a massacre that haunts you still. Soldiers open fire indiscriminately. The Hotchkiss guns pour shells into crowds of men, women, and children, and what began as a peaceful surrender becomes a slaughter. You try to maintain discipline among your men, but the situation spirals beyond control within minutes. Smoke from gunpowder obscures vision. Terrified Indians run in all directions, and soldiers fire at anything that moves. Some warriors fight back with whatever weapons they can find, but most of the casualties are unarmed women and children, caught in crossfire or deliberately targeted by panicked troops. The aftermath reveals the magnitude of the tragedy. At least 150 Lakota lie dead in the snow, their bodies frozen in the positions where they fell. Many are women and children who were shot while fleeing or trying to protect their families. A blizzard moves in after the shooting stops, covering the battlefield with snow and making body recovery impossible for 3 days. When the weather clears, photographers arrive to document the scene. You watch them arrange corpses for more dramatic pictures, turning human tragedy into newspaper sensations for readers back east. The images of frozen Indian bodies piled like cordwood will become symbols of the frontier's violent end, but they can't capture the sounds of wounded children crying in the snow or the smell of gunpowder mixed with blood. The official reports describe Wounded Knee as a battle against hostile Indians, but you know better. Most of the dead were unarmed, many were shot in the back while fleeing, and the battle lasted less than an hour from first shot to final casualty. 25 soldiers died, mostly from their own crossfire, while the Indian casualties were overwhelmingly civilian. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre that ended 4 centuries of warfare between European settlers and Native Americans. Your own role in the killing troubles your conscience in ways that previous Indian fights never did. You followed orders and tried to protect civilians, but you also participated in something that violated your sense of military honor. The Lakota at Wounded Knee weren't hostile warriors threatening American settlements. They were hungry, cold, desperate people seeking spiritual comfort in the face of cultural extinction. The broader context of your frontier service becomes clearer as the 1,890 seconds progress. The Indian Wars weren't just military conflicts. They were part of a systematic campaign to clear Native Americans from land needed for white settlement and economic development. Your cavalry regiment was the instrument of a policy that viewed Indian removal as necessary for national progress, regardless of the human cost. The 1,890 census declares the frontier officially closed, marking the end of the historical period that defined American expansion since colonial times. There are no longer large areas of unsettled land. No more Indian country to conquer. No more wilderness to tame. The continental United States has been surveyed, mapped, divided into states and territories, and integrated into a national economy connected by railroads and telegraph lines. Your post-military career reflects this transformation. Retiring from the army in 1895, you become a railroad security officer, protecting the same lines you once guarded during construction. The West you helped conquer is now safe for tourism, and wealthy Easterners pay premium prices to hunt buffalo, the few remaining, and visit Indian reservations, now safely pacified, as exotic attractions. The irony isn't lost on you. The savage Indians you fought for 8 years are now tourist curiosities performing war dances for paying customers. The hostile territory you patrolled is now crossed by passenger trains carrying comfortable tourists to scenic destinations. The dangerous frontier has become a nostalgic memory marketed to Americans who want to experience adventure without actual risk. Your reflections on the closing frontier are complicated by personal experiences that humanized your former enemies. You remember sharing tobacco with Lakota scouts who served with your regiment, learning to track game from Apache guides who knew desert survival techniques your military training never covered, and treating wounded Indian women and children who thanked you with dignity despite everything your uniform represented. The transformation of the American West from frontier to settled region happened with remarkable speed. In 1865, vast areas remained unmapped and uncontrolled by the federal government. By 1890, every acre had been surveyed. Most Indians were confined to reservations. Railroad networks connected remote regions to national markets, and territorial governments had been replaced by state administrations. Your final diary entry from December 1900, exactly 10 years after Wounded Knee, reflects on the frontier's meaning. We conquered a continent in the name of progress and civilization, but the cost in human terms was enormous. The Indians we fought were defending their homes and ways of life, just as we would defend ours. History will remember us as the generation that closed the frontier, but it should also remember that we did so through violence against peoples who had no choice in their fate. The tropical heat of Manila Bay presses against your uniform like a living thing as you watch the USS Maine's sister ships patrol the harbor. Your Colonel Theodore Martinez, son of a Mexican-American family from New Mexico, and your unlikely path to military leadership began with the Spanish-American War in 1898. The year is now 1904, and you're serving as military governor of a Philippine province, grappling with the contradictions of American empire in the Pacific. Your military career started dramatically during the brief, glorious Spanish-American War, caught up in the national fever following the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. You joined the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, Roosevelt's Rough Riders, as a lieutenant. The war seemed like a moral crusade, America liberating Cuba and the Philippines from Spanish oppression, spreading democracy and civilization to grateful colonial peoples. The Cuban campaign lived up to its romantic billing, at least initially. The Spanish forces collapsed quickly, unable to match American logistics and firepower. Your regiment's charge up San Juan Hill, with Theodore Roosevelt leading on foot, his horse had been shot, became the stuff of legend. For 3 months, you felt like you were participating in a grand historical mission, freeing oppressed peoples and establishing America as a world power. The Philippines presented a very different challenge. Filipino revolutionaries, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, had been fighting for independence from Spain for years, and they naturally assumed that American victory meant Filipino freedom. When it became clear that America intended to keep the islands as colonies, the Filipino independence movement turned its weapons against their former allies. The Philippine-American War that began in 1899 bore no resemblance to the heroic Spanish-American conflict. This was guerrilla warfare in tropical jungles against an enemy that knew every village and trail. Filipino fighters used hit-and-run tactics, disappearing into the population after attacks, making it impossible to distinguish between combatants and civilians. Your regiment spent months chasing ghosts through unfamiliar terrain in brutal heat and humidity. The moral complexity of the situation became clear during your first year in the Philippines. You were fighting people who wanted the same thing Americans had wanted in 1776, independence from foreign rule. Aguinaldo's proclamations quoted the Declaration of Independence and referred to George Washington as a model for Filipino resistance. How do you fight an enemy whose cause sounds so similar to your own nation's founding principles? The methods employed to suppress Filipino resistance troubled your conscience in ways that the Cuban campaign never had. Water torture to extract information from suspected insurgents, the burning of villages believed to harbour guerrillas, concentration camps for civilians suspected of supporting the independence movement. These tactics resembled Spanish oppression more than American liberation. Your Spanish language skills and Mexican-American heritage proved valuable for military intelligence work, but they also created uncomfortable parallels with the conquered population. Like Filipinos, your family had been conquered by American expansion, and like them, you had to choose between resistance and accommodation. Your success in the US military represented one path for colonized peoples, but it required accepting the legitimacy of conquest. The war officially ended in 1902 with Aguinaldo's capture, but guerrilla resistance continued sporadically for years. Your post-war assignment as provincial governor involved implementing American colonial policy, building schools and hospitals, constructing roads and telegraph lines, establishing courts and municipal governments based on American models. The benevolent assimilation that President McKinley promised required transforming Filipino society according to American standards of civilization and progress. The education mission became central to American colonial policy. You oversaw construction of hundreds of schools staffed by American teachers who taught Filipino children in English using American textbooks. The goal was to create a generation of Filipinos who would prefer American rule to independence, who would see American culture as superior to their indigenous traditions. But Filipino responses to American colonialism varied dramatically. Some elite families collaborated with American authorities, seeing colonial rule as preferable to the chaos of continued warfare. Others maintained passive resistance, accepting American administration while preserving Filipino cultural identity. A few continued active opposition, conducting sabotage and assassination campaigns against collaborators and American officials. Your personal relationships with Filipinos complicated your official duties. Dr. Jos Santos, a Filipino physician educated at the University of Santo Tomas, became a close friend despite serving a colonial administration he privately opposed. His dignified resistance to American cultural imperialism, maintaining Filipino customs while working within the colonial system, earned your respect even as it challenged your assumptions about American superiority. The economic dimensions of American colonialism proved as important as the political ones. American businesses invested heavily in Philippine sugar, tobacco, and mineral resources, creating economic ties that justified continued political control. Your reports to Washington emphasized the island's commercial potential, knowing that economic arguments carried more weight than strategic considerations in congressional debates. The racial attitudes that shaped American colonialism affected your own position within the military hierarchy. Despite your proven competence and combat record, some officers viewed your Mexican-American background as disqualifying you from commanding white troops or governing white territories. Your success in the Philippines was partly due to being considered suitable for colonial service in ways that might not apply to assignments in the continental United States. The broader implications of American empire became clear through correspondence with fellow officers serving in other new territories. Colleagues in Puerto Rico described similar challenges adapting American institutions to tropical societies, while friends stationed in Hawaii reported tensions between American settlers and native Polynesian populations. The Spanish-American War had made America an imperial power overnight, but nobody had prepared for the long-term responsibilities of governing diverse colonial populations. The contradiction between American democratic ideals and imperial realities created ongoing political problems. Anti-imperialists in the United States, led by figures like Mark Twain and William Jennings Bryan, argued that ruling other peoples without their consent violated fundamental American principles. Imperialists countered that spreading American civilization justified temporary restrictions on colonial self-government. Your tour of duty in the Philippines concluded in 1906, but the experience shaped your understanding of America's changing role in the world. The nation that had been born in rebellion against empire had become an empire itself, ruling millions of people who had no voice in American government. The democracy that proclaimed universal human rights applied those rights selectively based on race, geography, and political convenience. Returning to the United States, you found a country transformed by progressive reform movements. Theodore Roosevelt's presidency emphasized trust-busting and conservation, while cities installed electric lighting and subway systems. Women demanded voting rights, and reformers attacked political corruption. The domestic agenda of democratic reform contrasted sharply with the authoritarian governance you had administered in the Philippines. Your final assessment of American empire, written in 1910 as tensions rose in Europe, reflected deep ambivalence. We conquered an empire in the name of liberty, but liberty cannot be imposed by force. We brought democracy to peoples who had no voice in choosing their government, revealing the contradiction at the heart of our imperial mission. Perhaps the greatest test of American ideals will be whether we can govern an empire without betraying the principles that justified our own independence. The morning sun filters through the grimy windows of Hull House as you prepare for another day serving Chicago's immigrant neighborhoods. You're Margaret O'Sullivan, called Maggie by the children whose mothers trust you with their hopes and fears, and you've spent the last 6 years working alongside Jane Addams to address the social problems created by rapid industrialization and massive immigration. The year is 1908, and America is wrestling with the contradictions between democratic ideals and industrial realities. Your path to social work began at Wellesley College, where you studied economics and philosophy before discovering that academic theories meant little without practical experience in the real world. Jane Addams's lectures about settlement work inspired you to move to Chicago in 1902, joining the community of educated women who lived among the poor to better understand and address social problems. Hull House occupies a mansion in the heart of Chicago's 19th Ward, surrounded by tenements housing recent immigrants from Italy, Poland, Russia, and Greece. The contrast between the settlement's genteel Victorian interior and the crowded, unsanitary conditions outside your front door makes the work's urgency impossible to ignore. Every day brings encounters with problems that demand immediate attention and long-term solutions. Your typical day begins at 6 a.m. with visits to families experiencing crises. This morning, you check on Maria Rossi, whose husband was injured in a factory accident and received no compensation from his employer. Her 3 children haven't eaten in 2 days, and the landlord threatens eviction if the rent isn't paid by Friday. These individual tragedies repeat across thousands of immigrant families struggling to survive in an economy that values profit over human welfare. The kindergarten program you established serves 40 children whose working mothers have no childcare options. 5-year-old Giuseppe barely speaks English, but his bright eyes light up when you read stories about American heroes and democratic ideals. His mother works 14 hours a day in a garment factory, earning barely enough to pay rent and buy food. Giuseppe's education represents his family's hope for upward mobility, but it also highlights the gap between American promises and immigrant realities. Your evening English classes attract adults desperate to learn the language that will help them navigate American society. Pietro Lombardi, a skilled carpenter from Sicily, explains his frustration. In my country, I build beautiful furniture. Here, I can only get work as day labourer because I cannot speak English well. These talented, hard-working people need only opportunity and education to contribute fully to American society. The labour conditions you witness daily would shock comfortable middle-class Americans who enjoy the products of industrial manufacturing. Children as young as 10 work in factories, losing fingers to machinery and developing lung diseases from inhaling cotton fibres or chemical fumes. Women labour in sweatshops for 12 hours a day, earning wages that barely cover rent in overcrowded tenements. Industrial accidents kill or maim workers whose families receive no compensation for their losses. Your investigation of child labour practices leads to testimony before the Illinois State Legislature, where you describe watching 12-year-old boys work night shifts in glass factories, their small bodies exhausted by heat and dangerous machinery. These children should be in school, not in factories, you argue passionately. A nation that allows children to be exploited for profit has abandoned its moral foundations. The women's suffrage movement gains momentum during your Hull House years, and you join the campaign for voting rights while recognizing its class and racial limitations. Middle-class suffragettes argue that women's moral influence will purify politics, but working-class immigrant women need economic justice as much as political representation. The vote matters, but it won't immediately improve sweatshop conditions or eliminate child labour. Your friendship with Dr. Alice Hamilton, Hull House's resident physician, reveals the public health consequences of industrial capitalism. Her research on lead poisoning in paint factories, mercury exposure in hat-making shops, and phosphorus poisoning in match manufacturing demonstrates that worker health is sacrificed for corporate profits. Industrial diseases are preventable, she explains, but prevention requires acknowledging that workers are human beings, not just production costs. The cultural work at Hull House attempts to bridge the gap between American and immigrant traditions. Your evening programs feature Italian opera alongside American folk songs, Polish folk dances, next to lessons in American history. The goal is not to erase immigrant heritage, but to help newcomers maintain their cultural identities while adapting to American society. Success means creating hyphenated Americans, Italian Americans, Polish Americans, rather than forcing complete assimilation. The political corruption in Chicago's ward system becomes a constant frustration in your work. Alderman Johnny Powers controls jobs, city services, and police protection in your neighborhood. But his machine politics serve wealthy business interests rather than immigrant needs. When you organize tenants to demand housing code enforcement, Powers warns that troublemaking settlement workers might find their programs defunded and their building permits revoked. Your relationship with the labor movement creates tensions within Hull House's middle-class donor base. When garment workers strike for better wages and safer conditions, you support their demands despite knowing that wealthy contributors disapprove of settlement workers taking sides in labour disputes. Jane Addams backs your position, arguing that Hull House must stand with the poor and oppressed, even when it's politically uncomfortable. The 1,909 shirtwaist strike brings these tensions to a head. When young women garment workers walk out demanding better wages, shorter hours, and union recognition, you join their picket lines and raise money for strike support. Chicago's newspapers attack Hull House as a hotbed of radicalism, and several major donors withdraw their support. But you also witness remarkable solidarity among working women of different ethnicities, united by common exploitation. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City in 1911 validates your concerns about industrial safety. When 146 garment workers, mostly young immigrant women, die because factory owners locked exit doors to prevent theft, the tragedy demonstrates that worker safety cannot be left to corporate conscience. Your testimony before the Chicago City Council helps pass new fire safety regulations, but you know that similar tragedies will occur until systemic changes address the root causes of industrial exploitation. Your work with juvenile delinquents reveals how poverty and social conditions create crime. The children brought before Judge Ben Lindsay in the new juvenile court system aren't criminals by nature. They're products of environments that offer few legitimate opportunities for advancement. 10-year-old Antonio steals bread because his family is hungry. 14-year-old Katja becomes a prostitute because factory wages won't support her siblings. Punishment without addressing underlying causes only perpetuates cycles of poverty and crime. The presidential election of 1912 energizes progressive reformers as Theodore Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party adopts a platform calling for women's suffrage, child labor laws, worker compensation, and social insurance. For the first time, a major political party endorses the reforms you've been advocating through settlement work. Roosevelt's campaign slogan, "A square deal for every American," chained, resonates with immigrants and workers who have never heard politicians acknowledge their struggles before. Woodrow Wilson's victory brings mixed results for progressive causes. His New Freedom program attacks monopolies and reduces tariffs, but his Southern background makes him unsympathetic to racial equality and immigrant rights. When you write to the White House about lynching in the South, the response dismisses racial violence as a local matter beyond federal jurisdiction. The limits of progressive reform become clear when it confronts deeply rooted prejudices about race and ethnicity. Your personal life reflects the changing opportunities available to educated women. At 32, you remain unmarried by choice, pursuing a career that would be impossible to combine with traditional domestic duties. Your college friends who married and moved to suburbs sometimes express envy for your independence, while also pitying your spinsterhood. The new woman that progressive reformers celebrate still faces social pressure to choose between career and family in ways that men never do. The settlement house movement's broader impact extends beyond individual communities to influence national policy. Your careful documentation of child labour abuses, industrial accidents, and housing violations provides evidence that supports federal legislation regulating working conditions. The knowledge gained through daily contact with immigrant families informs immigration policy debates, though not always in directions you support. The growing tensions in Europe cast shadows over your domestic reform work. As war erupts in 1914, you join Jane Addams and other settlement workers in the peace movement, arguing that international conflicts will devastate the very communities you're trying to help. Immigrant families in Chicago still have relatives in the old country, and American entry into European warfare would force them to choose loyalties between their homeland and their new country. Your final reflection on the progressive era, written in December 1914 as Europe descends into unprecedented warfare, captures both the achievements and limitations of reform. We have made remarkable progress addressing the social problems created by industrialization and immigration, but deeper questions about economic justice and racial equality remain unanswered. The settlement house movement has proven that educated, committed people can improve conditions for the poor and oppressed But lasting change requires political transformation that challenges the fundamental structure of American capitalism and democracy. The blast furnace roars like a caged dragon as you check the temperature gauges that determine whether today's steel will meet Andrew Carnegie's exacting standards. You're Harrison Blackstone, called Harry by the men under your command, and you've worked your way up from puddler to foreman at the Homestead Steel Works outside Pittsburgh. The year is 1892, and you're caught between management demands for efficiency and worker demands for dignity in an industry that's transforming America into an industrial powerhouse. Your journey to the foreman's office began 20 years ago when you arrived in Pittsburgh as a 17-year-old farm boy from Ohio, drawn by newspaper advertisements promising steady work and good wages in the steel mills. The reality proved harsher than the advertisements suggested. 12-hour shifts in temperatures that reached 120 degrees, dangerous machinery that claimed fingers and lives, and wages that barely covered rent in the company housing that surrounded the mill like a feudal village. But America's industrial expansion created opportunities for ambitious young men willing to master complex technologies and command respect from diverse workforces. You learn to read the color of molten steel, to calculate the precise timing required to transform iron ore into high-quality steel, and to manage crews of men from a dozen different countries who spoke limited English but understood the universal language of industrial discipline. The steel industry's growth during the 1,880 seconds was nothing short of phenomenal. When you started at Homestead, the mill produced 50 tons of steel per day. By 1892, daily production exceeds 1,000 tons, feeding America's appetite for railroad rails, building beams, and machinery that's transforming the continent. The statistics are staggering. Steel production increased by 0% between 1,870 and 1,890 cns. But the human cost of this growth rarely appears in corporate reports or newspaper celebrations of American progress. Your workforce reflects the changing face of American labor. The skilled Anglo-American craftsmen who dominated steel production in the 1,870 seconds now work alongside Irish immigrants, German machinists, Polish laborers, and Italian newcomers. Each group brings different skills, expectations, and cultural traditions, creating a complex social dynamic that requires careful management to maintain productivity and prevent ethnic conflicts. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers represents the skilled craftsmen who still control critical aspects of steel production, but their power is gradually being undermined by new technologies that reduce the importance of traditional skills. Henry Clay Frick, Carnegie's ruthless manager, openly seeks to break the union's influence by mechanizing processes that previously required years of apprenticeship to master. The tension between labor and management reaches a breaking point in June 1892, when the Amalgamated Association's contract expires and Frick refuses to negotiate, instead announcing wage cuts and longer hours. As a foreman, you're caught in the middle, sympathetic to workers whose living standards are being squeezed, but also responsible to management for maintaining production levels that keep the mill profitable. The lockout begins on the 30th of June, when Frick shuts down the entire plant rather than accept union demands. 3,000 workers are suddenly unemployed, and the company brings in Pinkerton detectives to protect strikebreakers who will operate the mill under military guard. The sight of armed private police occupying an American industrial town shocks public opinion, but Frick is determined to crush the union permanently. The 6th of July brings violence that transforms a labor dispute into a battle for the soul of American industrial democracy. When barges carrying 300 armed Pinkerton detectives attempt to land at the mill's wharf, striking workers armed with rifles and dynamite fight a pitched battle that leaves 10 dead and dozens wounded. You watch from your house as smoke rises from burning buildings and gunfire echoes across the Monongahela River. The arrival of 8,000 Pennsylvania militia restores order but ends any possibility of Union victory. Under military protection, the mill reopens with strikebreakers and non-union workers, effectively breaking the Amalgamated Association's power at Homestead. You return to work in a transformed environment, where union activity is prohibited and worker grievances must be addressed through company channels that rarely favour employees. Your position as foreman becomes more important, but also more isolated after the strike's defeat. Management relies on foremen to maintain discipline and productivity without union interference, but workers view supervisors as company agents rather than advocates for their interests. The camaraderie that once existed between skilled workers and their supervisors disappears, replaced by an adversarial relationship that makes the workplace more efficient but less humane. The personal cost of industrial warfare affects your family life in unexpected ways. Your wife Martha, daughter of a Presbyterian minister, struggles with the moral implications of your role in breaking the strike. How can you work for men who hire private armies against American workers? She asks after church one Sunday. Her questions force you to examine whether your loyalty to the company conflicts with your obligations to the community and your Christian faith. The broader implications of the Homestead strike reverberate across American society. Labour leaders denounce the use of private police as industrial feudalism incompatible with Republican government. Business leaders defend property rights and managerial prerogatives as essential to industrial progress. Politicians struggle to balance competing claims about the role of government in labour disputes, while newspapers debate whether industrial warfare threatens democratic institutions. Your daily work routine in post-strike Homestead reveals both the efficiency gains and human costs of the new industrial order. Production increases as new machinery reduces dependence on skilled labour, but workplace accidents also increase as inexperienced workers operate dangerous equipment. The 12-hour shifts that Carnegie proudly describes as proof of American work ethic exhaust men who have families and civic responsibilities beyond their jobs. The ethnic tensions that simmered before the strike become more pronounced as management deliberately hires workers from different backgrounds to prevent unified resistance. Polish workers are housed separately from Irish families, Italian newcomers work different shifts from German craftsmen, and language barriers prevent communication that might lead to labour organising. This divide and conquer strategy maintains company control but fragments the community that once united around shared working-class identity. Your promotion to assistant superintendent in 1894 provides insight into the financial pressures driving industrial consolidation. Carnegie Steel Company faces intense competition from other producers, forcing constant cost-cutting measures that affect worker wages and safety investments. The choice often comes down to modernizing equipment or improving worker conditions, and shareholders invariably prefer expenditures that increase profits over those that enhance worker welfare. The Depression of 1893 to 1897 demonstrates how industrial workers bear the primary cost of economic downturns. While Carnegie and other steel magnates maintain their luxurious lifestyles, mill workers face unemployment, wage cuts, and eviction from company housing. Your role requires implementing layoffs and wage reductions that devastate families you've known for years, creating personal conflicts between loyalty to the company and sympathy for the workers. Yet the steel industry's growth also creates unprecedented opportunities for social mobility. Ambitious immigrants can advance from labourer to skilled worker to foreman within a decade, earning wages that allow them to buy houses, educate their children, and participate in American civic life. Your own rise from farm boy to management represents possibilities that wouldn't have existed in agricultural society or European industrial systems with rigid class barriers. The technological innovations you witness daily, the Bessemer process, open hearth furnaces, rolling mills that shape steel with precision machinery, represent human ingenuity applied to practical problems on an enormous scale. American steel production surpasses British output by 1890, making the United States the world's leading industrial nation within a generation. This achievement required sacrifice, but it also demonstrated democracy's capacity for rapid economic development. Your final assessment of the Gilded Age steel industry, written in 1895 as the Depression begins to ease, reflects the period's contradictions. We have built the most productive steel industry in history, creating wealth that seemed impossible when I started work 20 years ago. But this wealth has come at enormous human cost: broken unions, industrial warfare, workplace accidents, and social divisions that threaten the democratic community our prosperity was supposed to strengthen. Perhaps the next generation will find ways to preserve industrial efficiency while restoring human dignity to the workplace. The Sierra Nevada granite seems to mock your pickaxe as you chip away another handful of rock, knowing that today's progress will be measured in feet rather than miles. You're Sean Patrick O'Malley, 24 years old, and you've spent the last 3 years building the Central Pacific Railroad eastward from Sacramento through some of the most challenging terrain on the continent. The year is 1867, and you're part of the greatest construction project in American history, the Transcontinental Railroad that will finally unite the Pacific and Atlantic coasts. Your journey to California began in County Cork, Ireland, where the potato famine killed your younger sister and forced your family to choose between starvation and emigration. The coffin ship that carried you across the Atlantic in 1862 was a floating hell of disease and desperation, but surviving the crossing seemed easier than surviving another winter in Ireland. America represented hope for a better life, even if that life began with the backbreaking labour that native-born Americans preferred to avoid. The Civil War created opportunities for immigrants willing to do dangerous work, while American men fought each other in distant battles. When Congress authorized the Pacific Railway Act in 1862, it launched a massive construction project that required more workers than California could provide. Chinese immigrants supplied much of the labor force, but Irish workers like you filled supervisory roles and handled the most dangerous blasting operations. Working alongside Chinese laborers challenged your assumptions about race and ability in ways that nothing in Ireland had prepared you for. The Chinese workers, celestials in the casual racism of the day, end quote, proved themselves master craftsmen and fearless climbers, hanging from ropes to place explosives in granite cliffs that would have terrified most white workers. Their discipline, skill, and courage earned grudging respect from Irish supervisors who had expected to find them inferior. The engineering challenges of crossing the Sierra Nevada required innovations that pushed 19th century technology to its limits. Tunneling through solid granite with hand tools and black powder, you advance perhaps 8 inches per day through rock that seems harder than the steel tools used to cut it. The Summit Tunnel, at 1,659 feet, the longest bore on the entire railroad, takes nearly 2 years to complete and cost dozens of lives to accidents, avalanches, and explosions. Your daily routine begins before dawn with a breakfast of salt, pork, beans, and coffee strong enough to dissolve horseshoes. The work crews organise along ethnic lines, Irish handling explosives and supervision, Chinese doing precision rock work, Germans operating steam machinery imported from the East. Despite language barriers and cultural differences, you develop working relationships based on mutual dependence in dangerous conditions where mistakes can kill everyone nearby. The winter of 186667 tests your endurance beyond anything you experienced in Ireland. Snow accumulates to depths of 40 feet, and temperatures drop so low that exposed skin freezes within minutes. Work continues through blizzards, using techniques borrowed from mining, cruise tunnel, through snowdrifts, to reach work sites, creating an underground world of passages and chambers carved from snow and ice. Avalanches become your greatest fear during Sierra Nevada winters. The snow builds up on steep slopes above the railroad grade until even small vibrations can trigger massive slides that bury work crews instantly. You lose 3 friends to an avalanche near Donner Pass, their bodies not recovered until spring thaw reveals the tragedy's full scope. The mountains seem determined to resist human intrusion, claiming lives as payment for every mile of progress. The supply problems facing railroad construction in remote mountains boggle your mind with their complexity. Every tool, every stick of dynamite, every pound of food must be transported hundreds of miles from Sacramento, over primitive roads that become impassable during winter months. A simple mistake in ordering can delay work for weeks while correct materials are shipped from San Francisco or even the East Coast. Your wages of $35 per month represent more money than your family in Ireland sees in a year. But the cost of living in California camps consumes most of your earnings. Everything is expensive. A loaf of bread costs 50 cents, a pound of butter costs $1.50, and a bottle of whiskey, essential for fighting off mountain cold, costs $3. The company stores charge premium prices for goods that workers can't obtain elsewhere, creating a system of economic dependence that keeps labourers perpetually in debt. The racial tensions that simmer throughout the project occasionally explode into violence that threatens construction schedules. Some Irish workers resent Chinese labourers for accepting lower wages, while Chinese workers face discrimination in housing, food allowances, and medical care. Your position as a blasting foreman requires maintaining peace between groups who might prefer fighting each other to fighting the mountain, but shared danger usually overcomes ethnic prejudices. The technical innovations you witness daily represent remarkable achievements in applied engineering. Nitroglycerin, a new explosive far more powerful than black powder, reduces tunneling time, but also increases the danger of accidental detonations that can destroy entire work crews. The use of Chinese basket weavers suspended on ropes to place explosives in impossible locations becomes standard practice, though the casualty rate remains horrifying. Communication with the Union Pacific Railroad, building westward from Omaha, comes through telegraph lines that follow the construction crews. The competition between the two companies intensifies as they race toward the meeting point that will complete the transcontinental connection. Government subsidies reward each company for miles of track completed, creating incentives for rapid construction that sometimes compromise quality and safety. The environmental impact of railroad construction becomes apparent as work progresses through pristine wilderness areas. Forests are clear-cut for lumber and fuel, streams are diverted for construction water, and mountainsides are blasted away to create level roadbeds. The railroad brings civilization to the wilderness, but it also destroys natural landscapes that have existed unchanged since the last ice age. Your letters home to Ireland attempt to describe experiences that seem impossible to relatives who have never seen mountains or deserts. We are building a road for iron horses through mountains that touch the clouds, you write to your brother Patrick, knowing that the words can't convey the reality of hanging from ropes on 1,000-foot cliffs while placing explosives in granite walls. The railroad represents progress and prosperity, but achieving those benefits requires human sacrifices that comfortable people back east never acknowledge. The ceremonial meeting of the Central Pacific and Union Pacific at Promontory Point, Utah, on the 10th of May 1869, culminates 6 years of the most challenging construction project in American history. You're present as Leland Stanford drives the golden spike connecting the rails that finally span the continent. But the ceremony feels anticlimactic after the daily struggles required to reach this moment. The speeches celebrate national achievement and technological progress, but they don't mention the Chinese, Irish, and other immigrant workers whose labour made the railroad possible. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad transforms American geography and economics almost immediately. Travel time from New York to San Francisco drops from 6 months to 6 days, making continental commerce practical for the first time. California's agricultural products can reach eastern markets, while manufactured goods from eastern factories become available throughout the West. The United States truly becomes a continental nation, united by ribbons of steel that conquer distance and geography. Your personal transformation reflects the broader changes that railroad construction brought to American society. You arrived in California as an impoverished Irish refugee. You leave as a skilled construction foreman with savings that will allow you to buy land and start a family. The railroad that carried you west also carried thousands of other immigrants, seeking opportunities that didn't exist in their homelands, creating the diverse society that defines American identity. The environmental and social costs of the Transcontinental Railroad become more apparent as years pass. Native American tribes lose their traditional territories to railroad construction and the settlements that follow the rails. Buffalo herds are slaughtered to feed construction crews and later for sport by passengers riding the completed railroad. The Plains Indians' way of life disappears within a generation of the railroad's completion, replaced by an industrial economy that has no place for traditional cultures. Your final reflection on the Transcontinental Railroad project, written 20 years later as you watch your Irish American children prepare for college, captures both pride and regret. We built something magnificent, a railroad that united a continent and proved that human determination can overcome any obstacle. But we also began the destruction of wilderness and native cultures that may have been more valuable than the progress we achieved. History will judge whether the benefits of our work outweighed the costs, but I remain proud to have participated in the greatest construction project of our time. The telegraph key chatters urgently in your cluttered newspaper office as reports filter in from Charleston Harbor, each message bringing news that will shatter the fragile peace holding America together. Your Daniel Webster Thompson, named for the great orator who once preserved the Union through compromise, and you publish the Springfield Republican in a small Illinois town where Abraham Lincoln practiced law before seeking higher office. The year is 1860, and you're documenting the final collapse of American democracy as sectional differences prove irreconcilable through political means. Your newspaper has chronicled the growing crisis since the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 opened new territories to slavery through popular sovereignty. What seemed like a reasonable compromise to Congress unleashed violent conflict between pro-slavery and free soil settlers, turning Kansas into a rehearsal for civil war. Your editorials argued for peaceful resolution, but events have moved beyond the reach of moderate voices appealing to shared national identity. The Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, which you covered extensively for readers fascinated by the intellectual combat between Illinois' political giants, revealed the fundamental incompatibility of Northern and Southern positions on slavery's expansion. Douglas's popular sovereignty satisfied neither section, while Lincoln's House divided speech articulated the moral dimensions that made compromise impossible. The debates elevated Lincoln to national prominence, but they also demonstrated that American democracy could no longer contain the slavery question within normal political boundaries. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in October 1859 shattered any remaining hope for peaceful resolution. Your editorial, condemning Brown's violence, reflected mainstream Northern opinion, but Southern newspapers quoted it as proof that all Yankees secretly supported slave insurrection. Brown's execution made him a martyr to abolitionists, while confirming Southern fears that the Republican Party represented an existential threat to their social order. The presidential election of 1860 becomes a referendum on American Union itself. The Democratic Party splits along sectional lines, with Northern Democrats nominating Stephen Douglas, while Southern Democrats choose John Breckinridge. The Constitutional Union Party's nomination of John Bell appeals to conservatives seeking to preserve the Union through avoidance of the slavery issue. Lincoln's Republican nomination, on a platform of preventing slavery's expansion, completes the field of candidates representing irreconcilable positions. Your coverage of Lincoln's campaign requires delicate balance between partisan enthusiasm and journalistic objectivity. As a Republican newspaper in Lincoln's home region, you support his candidacy while recognizing that his election might trigger Southern secession. Lincoln's speeches in Springfield, which you attend as both journalist and neighbor, reveal a man aware that he might be presiding over the nation's dissolution rather than its preservation. The election results confirm your worst fears about sectional polarization. Lincoln wins the presidency with less than 40% of the popular vote, carrying no Southern states and demonstrating that America now elects presidents through sectional coalitions rather than national consensus. Southern newspapers immediately begin discussing secession as the only alternative to black Republican rule, while Northern papers dismiss secession threats as political posturing designed to extract concessions. South Carolina's secession on the 20th of December 1860 transforms political rhetoric into constitutional crisis. Your front-page headline, "The Union Dissolved," captures the shock that reverberates through Illinois communities that suddenly face the prospect of fighting their Southern neighbors. The mail brings letters from relatives in Georgia and Alabama explaining why they must choose sectional loyalty over national allegiance. Personal correspondence that makes abstract political differences painfully real. The creation of the Confederate States of America in February 1861 demonstrates Southern determination to make secession permanent, rather than using it as a negotiating tactic. Your reporting on Confederate constitution making reveals a political system designed to protect slavery while claiming the Revolutionary War's legacy of self-government. Jefferson Davis's inaugural address, which you quote extensively, appropriates the language of 1776 to justify the destruction of the nation founded by that revolution. President Lincoln's inauguration speech, which you cover from the Capitol steps, attempts to reassure the South while maintaining federal authority. His promise that the government will not assail you offers peace to those willing to remain in the Union, but his declaration that the Union is unbroken denies the legitimacy of secession. The speech satisfies neither section completely, leaving the fundamental questions to be resolved through events rather than words. Your personal relationships reflect the broader social divisions tearing American communities apart. Your brother-in-law, a merchant with business connections in New Orleans, argues that Southern secession might be beneficial if it avoids civil war. Your Methodist minister preaches that slavery is sinful, but questions whether preserving the Union justifies military coercion of Southern states. These conversations force you to examine your own assumptions about the relationship between democracy, federalism, and moral principle. The Fort Sumter crisis in April 1861 crystallizes the impossible choices facing both sections. Lincoln's decision to resupply the federal garrison forces Confederate leaders to choose between accepting federal authority or firing the first shots of civil war. Your editorial analysis recognizes that both sides have maneuvered themselves into positions where compromise appears impossible without complete capitulation to the other section's demands. The bombardment of Fort Sumter on the 12th of April 1861 ends the secession crisis and begins the Civil War that will determine whether American democracy can survive its greatest challenge. Your eyewitness account, based on telegraph reports from Charleston, describes the strange excitement that accompanies the beginning of hostilities both sides have simultaneously dreaded and desired. War brings terrible clarity to issues that political rhetoric had only confused. Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion triggers the second wave of secession, as Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas join the Confederacy rather than provide troops to fight their southern neighbors. Your coverage of local enlistment meetings reveals community divisions previously hidden beneath surface civility, families split between Union and Confederate sympathy, businesses boycotted for their owners' political views, churches divided over biblical interpretations of slavery and rebellion. Your final editorial, before enlisting in the Union Army, reflects on the failure of American democracy to resolve its greatest challenge through peaceful means. We have reached the point where ballots cannot settle what bullets must decide. The generation that inherited the blessings of democratic government has proven unable to preserve those blessings through wisdom and compromise. Whether the nation that emerges from this conflict will justify the sacrifices required to preserve it remains to be determined by providence and the courage of free men. The morning light filtering through your chamber's tall windows illuminates the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, its legal language transforming you from impartial arbiter of justice into an agent of human bondage. Your Judge Samuel Adams Parker, named for the revolutionary patriot who declared that resistance to tyranny is obedience to God, and you've spent 15 years on the federal bench in Massachusetts, believing that law and justice were synonymous. The year is 1854, and the cases on your docket are forcing you to choose between legal duty and moral conscience. Your judicial career began with faith that American law embodied the natural rights principles of the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution might contain compromises with slavery, but you believed those compromises would gradually disappear as the nation matured in its commitment to human equality. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 seemed to establish slavery's geographical limits, while the political system appeared capable of managing sectional differences through democratic debate and legislative compromise. The Compromise of 1850 shattered your constitutional optimism by requiring federal judges to become active participants in slavery's enforcement. The Fugitive Slave Act mandates that you issue warrants for suspected runaway slaves based solely on affidavits from alleged masters, denying the accused any meaningful legal defense. Worse, the law requires all citizens to assist in capturing fugitives, making every American complicit in slavery's continuation. Your first fugitive slave case presents the moral dilemma in its starkest form. Thomas Williams, a man who has lived peacefully in Boston for 3 years, is claimed as property by a Virginia planter who produces documents that may or may not be authentic. Williams has a wife, children, and a job. He attends church regularly and pays taxes that support local schools. Under Massachusetts law, he is a free citizen. Under federal law, he is escaped property subject to return without legal process. The courtroom drama reveals the human cost of treating people as property. Williams's wife collapses when you issue the removal order, while his children scream for their father as U.S. Marshals drag him away in chains. The crowd of Boston citizens who pack your courtroom include many whose ancestors fought at Lexington and Concord for the principle that government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. Today, you're using federal power to enforce human bondage against people who never consented to be enslaved. Your legal reasoning attempts to separate personal morality from judicial duty, but the distinction proves impossible to maintain. The law is the law, you declare from the bench, and federal judges must enforce federal statutes regardless of personal opinion. Yet your private diary reveals the emotional toll of sending human beings back to slavery. I have become what my revolutionary ancestors fought against, a government official using legal authority to suppress natural rights. The Underground Railroad operating throughout New England challenges your faith in gradual, legal solutions to moral problems. Harriet Tubman, William Still, and other conductors routinely violate the Fugitive Slave Act by helping escapees reach Canada, choosing moral law over civil law when the two conflict. Their civil disobedience represents the same principle that justified American resistance to British taxation, but now it's directed against laws you're sworn to enforce. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 extends the moral crisis by opening previously free territory to slavery through popular sovereignty. Stephen Douglas's great principle of self-government sounds democratic in theory, but in practice it means that some Americans can vote to enslave other Americans. Your correspondence with fellow judges reveals widespread concern that democratic procedures are being used to destroy democratic principles. The violence in Bleeding Kansas demonstrates that popular sovereignty leads to civil war rather than peaceful resolution. Pro-slavery and free soil settlers use fraud, intimidation, and violence to control territorial elections, while Congress proves incapable of determining which government represents the legitimate will of Kansas citizens. The failure of democratic procedures in Kansas foreshadows their potential collapse throughout the nation. Personal encounters with abolitionists force you to confront the gap between legal training and moral reasoning. When Theodore Parker visits your chambers to protest the Fugitive Slave Act, his arguments challenge your fundamental assumptions about law's relationship to justice. Judge Parker, he asks, would you have enforced the Stamp Act in 1775? Would you have returned escaped serfs to their masters in medieval Europe? At what point does legal duty become moral complicity with evil? The Anthony Burns case in 1854 brings these tensions to a breaking point. Burns, claimed as a fugitive slave, attracts support from Boston's entire abolitionist community, including prominent ministers, lawyers, and intellectuals who argue that federal law contradicts natural law. Your decision to order Burns's return to slavery requires military protection from federal troops, turning Boston into an occupied city to enforce human bondage in the cradle of American liberty. The public reaction to the Burns case reveals how deeply the Fugitive Slave Act has divided Northern society. Church bells toll as Burns is marched through Boston streets under military guard, while thousands of citizens line the route in silent protest. The symbolism is overwhelming. Federal bayonets forcing slavery on Massachusetts citizens whose ancestors died to establish the principle that governments must protect rather than violate natural rights. Your correspondence with Southern judges reveals their different perspective on the same legal issues. Judge Robert Campbell of Richmond writes that the Fugitive Slave Act finally forces northern states to respect Southern property rights protected by the Constitution. Slavery is legal throughout the United States, he argues. State laws that interfere with slaveholder rights are the real constitutional violations, not federal enforcement of legitimate property claims. The Dred Scott decision in 1857 carries the logic of slavery's constitutionality to its ultimate conclusion. Chief Justice Taney's majority opinion declares that African Americans had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that Congress cannot prohibit slavery in federal territories. The decision effectively nationalizes slavery by denying both federal and state governments the power to restrict slaveholder rights anywhere in the United States. Your analysis of Dred Scott reveals constitutional logic pushed beyond moral reason. If the Constitution protects slavery as property, then democratic majorities cannot vote to restrict that property without violating constitutional rights. Popular sovereignty becomes meaningless, congressional authority disappears, and state rights collapse before federal protection of slavery. The decision attempts to remove slavery from democratic debate by constitutional interpretation, but it only intensifies political conflict by closing off legal alternatives to moral disagreement. The Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858 crystallize the fundamental issue underlying all specific controversies about slavery's expansion. Lincoln's House-divided speech argues that the nation cannot permanently endure half slave and half free, while Douglas's popular sovereignty attempts to avoid moral judgment by leaving the decision to local majorities. Your legal training recognizes that both positions have constitutional merit, but they cannot be reconciled through legal reasoning. The John Brown raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 represents the complete breakdown of legal solutions to moral conflicts. Brown's attempt to trigger slave insurrection through violence abandons democratic processes entirely, but his trial speeches invoke the same natural rights principles that justified American independence. Your reaction to Brown's execution reveals your own transformation. He chose to become a martyr for the cause of human freedom, and martyrs often accomplish through death what they could not achieve through life. Your final judicial opinion, before resigning from the federal bench, attempts to explain why American law can no longer command moral respect. When legal systems require good men to do evil things, those systems lose their claim to obedience. The Fugitive Slave Act has transformed federal judges into slave catchers and turned courtrooms into auction blocks. I can no longer serve a legal system that treats human beings as property, and I pray that my resignation will encourage others to examine their own complicity with institutionalized evil. The gaslight flickers in your embassy study as you compose another dispatch to Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, trying to explain European political tensions that seem incomprehensible to Americans accustomed to continental security. Your ambassador Charles Hamilton Sterling, career diplomat and grandson of a Civil War general, and your posting to Vienna has given you a front row seat to the forces that will soon drag the world into unprecedented warfare. The year is 1914, and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand has triggered a diplomatic crisis that threatens to engulf the civilization you've spent your career trying to preserve. Your diplomatic service began in 1885, during the confident years when America was emerging as a world power, but remained protected by oceanic distances from European conflicts. The Spanish-American War of 1898 announced American arrival on the global stage, but most Americans still viewed foreign entanglements as violations of Washington's farewell address warnings. Your career has spanned America's transformation from isolated republic to reluctant world power, and now you're witnessing the collapse of the international system that made American security possible. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, where you serve, represents everything America rejected in its founding, autocratic government, ethnic oppression, aristocratic privilege, and military solutions to political problems. Yet your years in Vienna have revealed the complexity underlying simple American assumptions about democracy and progress. The empire provides stability for dozens of ethnic groups who might face persecution or genocide under nationalist governments, while its cultural achievements rival anything produced by democratic societies. The Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913 demonstrated how quickly localized conflicts could escalate into international crises. Your reports to Washington described the ethnic hatreds that make compromise impossible between Serbs, Bulgarians, Greeks, and Turks, but State Department responses suggested that American diplomats were exaggerating the significance of distant quarrels between backward peoples. The failure to understand Balkan nationalism's destructive potential reflects broader American misunderstanding of European political realities. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand on the 28th of June 1914 triggers a diplomatic crisis unlike anything in your experience. The heir to the Austrian throne dies in Sarajevo at the hands of Serbian nationalists, creating a conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia that draws in their respective allies through treaty obligations that seemed theoretical when negotiated. Your cables to Washington grow increasingly urgent as you realize that this local incident might destroy European civilization. The alliance system that was designed to preserve peace through balance of power proves to be a mechanism for transforming limited conflicts into general war. Austria, Hungary's declaration of war against Serbia, activates Russia's commitment to protect Slavic peoples, which triggers Germany's support for Austria, which brings France into the conflict through the Franco-Russian alliance, which causes Germany to invade Belgium, which finally brings Britain into a war that began with a single pistol shot in a Balkan city most Americans couldn't locate on a map. Your final diplomatic dispatch before communication lines are severe is a desperate plea for American mediation. You warn that the world is on the brink of a conflagration that will make all previous wars look like minor skirmishes. You argue that America, as the only major power with no entangling alliances, holds the unique position to halt this madness before it consumes the continent. The response from Washington is a mix of concern and detachment. Secretary Bryan, a committed pacifist, hopes for a peaceful resolution, but is constrained by President Wilson's desire to maintain American neutrality. Your advice is noted, but not acted upon. As the last train carrying American civilians departs Vienna, you stand on the platform, watching the chaos unfold. The gaslight flickers no longer. It is replaced by the dim, uncertain glow of a world preparing for war. And now, as Ambassador Sterling witnesses the fading embers of European peace, we see a United States that has completely transformed. From a fledgling republic shielded by two oceans, America has grown into a world power. The confidence of the American people, built on the foundations of victory in the Revolutionary War, continuous territorial expansion, and the unifying force of the Civil War, forged a distinct national spirit that valued independence and avoided the quagmires of the Old World. The story of the United States from 1776 to the eve of World War I is a journey of evolution, from a revolutionary ideal to the complex reality of power and responsibility. It shows us that even as America saw itself as an empire of liberty, it still had to confront internal challenges of social and racial justice, as well as external pressures. The journey from an isolated nation to a global superpower was just beginning. And when Ambassador Sterling sends his final dispatch, he's not just reporting on a diplomatic crisis. He's warning of the end of an era, a world that is about to change forever, and a United States that, whether it likes it or not, can no longer remain a spectator. Thank you for listening to this story of America's turbulent historical journey. If you found this historical narrative engaging, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on the next captivating stories about human history. Your support motivates us to continue exploring and sharing these valuable stories. See you in the next video.